Welcome to Ask GMBN Tech, where we get to answer your questions using the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech. We're in an In the Woods special, so let's crack on. We've got a great question here from John Smith, and he says, are we forever stuck at 200mm? I'd love to see a modern day Super Monster T. Okay, the Super Monster T in question was a wild 300mm travel fork from Osoku. It was based off I'm not sure if it was an MX Trials fork or a full-on motocross fork, and it had a lot of travel. Downhill racers now are using around 200mm of travel, but they are using 29-inch front wheels versus the 26-inch that's squeezed into the Monster fork. And yeah, those bigger wheels do roll quicker and absorb bumps better because of the approach angle. So yeah, I mean, I'm moving things around because the Super Monster Ts weren't really for racers, it was for free riders. And well, those guys are doing flips and tricks and whips. So do we need a 300mm travel fork? Yeah, I don't think we do, but let us know in the comments if you think we need one. Engaging question here from Stud JJ2000. Hi GMBN Tech. Do I actually need a 50-tooth cassette? Okay, there's a lot going into it. Short answer is no, not necessarily, you don't. The big 52 and 50-tooth rear cassettes, in line with kind of like these newer, wide-ranging 1x drivetrains, mean that you can almost have your cake and eating it. With 1x, you're reducing the number of gears down from a double or a triple, and it means that yes, you kind of have this range, you don't have the steps, but you've still got this huge range. So you've got the very top gear in terms of very lowest gear ratio, so you can crawl up hills, but you've also got a really low, smallest cog, where you can power down on descents and on road sections. Do you need that? Well, I mean, that depends on where you're riding. What you could do is you could get away with a much smaller drivetrain if you went sort of a smaller cassette and a smaller chainring. You'd still be able to get that very crawlery gear at the top. You'd probably have a bit more chainring clearance too, but unfortunately that small chainring at the front with the 11 or 10 tooth just wouldn't provide the extra kind of muscle that the bigger chainring on the front would provide with the super cassette with a 50 tooth on. So yeah, I mean, the best way of explaining drivetrains, if this helps on bikes, is that we're looking at the kind of rolling diameter of the back wheel and how one crank revolution can move that forward. So that's why this little cassette and really big cassette tooth combos work well, because it gives you loads of range. But you can compromise, definitely. Just, you have to be honest with you and your legs in terms of if you're riding lots and you're only using the climbing gears, you might be able to get away with a smaller cassette and a smaller front chainring. But if you're constantly using the whole range from the 50 down to the 10, you really have to power on the road to get to your trailhead, you might not be able to compromise. But it's up to you and it's up to your trails, but it is possible. Okay, a long question here from Shaf Hamid, which will pop up all the question. Essentially, he's got two questions. One about the service intervals on mountain bike suspension forks, and another about motocross fluids and oils. So we'll answer that first one first. Yes, you can use motocross fluids in your suspension forks, as long as they're the same weight. So suspension forks use different weights of oil to modify the damping performance. And yeah, you can. I mean, Fox, Öhlins and other brands do make motocross and a motorbike fork, so their fluids would be interchangeable between their models. I guess the question back to the service intervals and why they're much longer on a motocross bike versus why they're quite short on a mountain bike is down to the performance of that fork. And I don't mean just how well it functions in terms of absorbing bumps, but how well it functions overall. And because we don't have a motor, we need to make everything as light as possible. And that means brands need to kind of work to minimise structures in the fork and make them as light as possible. So one of the compromises that they have for this is having a slightly shorter service interval where you have to do a lower leg service to replace the parts. On a motocross fork, it's much bigger. They've got an engine and they can use much thicker parts, lots more oil inside to keep everything lubricated, which is why they can have longer service intervals. But I think it's interesting, actually. There's a couple of brands out there who do have motocross sort of backgrounds, and that's Osoku, who do have a longer service interval. So their Super Z fork has got an overall service interval of around 125 hours, which is quite long. And also RockShox have got a 50-hour window for their lower leg service too. So there are longer hours out there. Hope that helps. Snowman22 asks, can I spray my rear triangle with silicone spray to quiet the creaking? It's a carbon frame. No, please don't do that. I mean, it might make it look shiny and it might make your brakes not work and it might make your lube rinse off your chain, but we don't recommend just spraying willy-nilly lots of silicone spray to fix a creak. We've done quite a few videos on this, and I would say the key thing is to, systematically work through any moving parts. You haven't said if you've got a hardtail or a full suspension, but just work through either the suspension pivots or all the parts. The videos are really helpful because it is a systematic approach that you've got to do. It will probably be a part, hopefully, that's just not torqued up to the required Newton meters that's creating the creak, but it is really worthwhile and really important to check your bike if it's creaking. And that's because if it's not a part that just needs to be tightened up, it could be part of the frame or a key component starting to break. And that creak is the parts rubbing together. And what you would like to do is find that creak before you find yourself on the trail and your bike in two pieces. So yeah, don't just use silicone spray as a quick fix. Do the systematic stuff to work out where the creak is coming from. Fun seasonal question here from good friend Tim. Hello, Tim. He says, top tips for washing and reproofing before we put kit away for winter or before we start riding in the winter. Yes, there are lots of tips. It's a really good question. So lots of outdoor gear, specifically those with the DWRs, which stand for durable water resistant coatings. And they're on showerproof, windproof sort of soft shell jackets. They're also on the kind of taped seamed hard shell stuff as well. And it's effectively a layer on the outside that helps the water bead off and it helps the jacket breathe. So they're really essential to making your waterproof and making your soft shells work as they should. Lots of them need to be washed in dedicated tech wash materials. So they're a lot gentler and not as harsh, and they don't sort of fill those gaps with nice smelling things. So make sure that you use these dedicated cleaners to wash your jackets. There's also lots of dedicated reproofing materials. So some jackets will need a spray on one, some will need a wash in. The instructions on your jacket should say. Also, lots of jackets and the reproofers will have dedicated ways of sort of setting these sprays and washes. Often it's tumble drying at a low temperature in a tumble dryer, and that means that the reproofing material, so this water resistant layer, is all over the jacket and not just in patches. But yeah, Granger's, Nickwax are two brands that I use regularly, and they kind of do lots of different products, whether they spray on or in wash. Key thing is read the instructions on your jacket, because some jackets are going to have different instructions. But yeah, it's really good to do it now so your jacket is both more breathable than it's been and more water repellent for the grim weather that we're probably going to have in the Northern Hemisphere. Die for Nothing Gamer. Good question here. Can upgrading the size of your rotors help alleviate brake fade? Sure can. Anna has done a brilliant video on how upping your rotor size and the associated mounting hardware can really boost your braking performance. But before you go wild, and depending on if you've got the kit already, it might be cheaper to give your brakes a bleed, because the fresh fluid should resist that fade effect, and also replacing your pads. But if you've replaced your pads already and you've given your brake a full fluid change, like a full bleed, then yeah, changing the rotors, changing the mounting hardware will be the best way of resisting brake fade. So the reason why that bigger rotor can help alleviate brake fade is simply it's bigger and it can spread the heat a lot more. So this limits the glazing of the pads, because the pads aren't going to get as hot. So it's the pads braking that get hot. It's then the rotor not being able to cool as quickly, so the heat just stays in the system that forms a kind of glaze layer. It's almost like a ceramic on your brakes, and it means that your brakes won't work very well and you might have to rebuff in your pads or just get new ones. But yeah, hopefully all that helps. That bleed can help, honest. If you've got any questions, do use the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech on any of the off-road channels and we'll answer them. We love answering them. We love hearing your comments. So if you've got any more questions, let us know.